Here's something that should genuinely bother you. You take your car in, the mechanic pumps the pedal twice, connects a little tube to a valve the size of your thumbnail, and 45 minutes later hands you a bill for $150, sometimes $200, for brake bleeding, a job that requires no diagnostic equipment, no specialist knowledge, and in its simplest form, uses nothing but gravity in a jar. The markup on this particular service is, and I say this with complete respect for the trade, absolutely breathtaking. Today, that stops. You're doing this yourself. What brake bleeding actually is and why it matters. Let's start with the honest version of the science, because once you understand what's actually happening is inside your brake lines, this whole job makes complete sense and stops feeling intimidating. Your brakes are a hydraulic system. When you push the pedal, you're not pulling cables or shoving rods. You're pushing brake fluid through sealed lines, and that fluid pressure squeezes your brake pads against your rotors and stops the car. Hydraulic fluid is incompressible. That's the whole trick. Push the pedal, pressure travels instantly through the fluid. Brakes apply. Physics does the work. Now here's the problem. Air is compressible. If air gets into those lines, even a small bubble, you push the pedal, and instead of instantly transferring pressure to the brakes, you're first compressing that bubble. The pedal feels soft, spongy, or in bad cases, it travels halfway to the floor before anything happens. That is not a sensation you want to discover for the first time at a junction. Air gets in a few ways. Brake fluid absorbs moisture over time, and that moisture eventually boils under heat and turns to vapor bubbles. You open the system for a caliper replacement or a line repair, and air sneaks in. Or you've simply never bled the brakes on a car you bought used, and the previous owner, well, let's be generous and say they had other priorities. Bleeding the brakes means pushing fresh fluid through the system until every trace of air and old, degraded fluid comes out the other end. That's it. That's the whole job. And once you've done it once, you'll never pay someone else to do it again. How to know if your brakes actually need bleeding? The most obvious sign is a spongy or soft pedal. Press it, and it doesn't feel firm and immediate. It feels like pressing into a slightly deflated basketball instead of a solid wall of hydraulic resistance. A pedal that slowly sinks toward the floor when you hold pressure at a stop is another one. Not dramatically, just a slow, creeping fade. That's air in the system. Or it's a failing master cylinder, which we'll come back to. If you've recently had any brake work done, new calipers, new lines, a master cylinder replacement, bleeding is not optional. It's part of the job. And any shop that does brake work without bleeding afterward is cutting corners so sharp they could use them as brake pads. Here's the honest caveat, and I'm going to give you a few of these throughout because it matters. A spongy pedal that returns after you've bled the system properly, or a pedal that sinks while the car is just sitting still at a red light, can also mean a failing master cylinder or an internal seal leak. Bleeding doesn't fix a mechanical failure. If you bleed the brakes correctly and the sponginess comes back within a few days, you've got a bigger problem, and you do need a shop. Knowing that line is part of being a competent DIYer. The rest of this job, though, is yours. The 4 bleeding methods explained. There are 4 ways to bleed brakes, and every forum on the internet has a passionate argument about which one is correct. Here's the honest breakdown. Gravity bleeding is exactly what it sounds like. You open the bleeder screw, and gravity slowly pulls fresh fluid from the reservoir down through the lines and out the bleeder, pushing air and old fluid ahead of it. It's slow. It takes patience. It requires absolutely no special tools and no helper. For a routine fluid refresh or chasing out a small amount of air, when it works beautifully and costs you nothing but time. Vacuum bleeding uses the hand pump that you connect to the bleeder screw to suck fluid and air through. It's faster than gravity and still a one-person job. The genuine downside: cheap vacuum pump kits can suck air past the bleeder screw threads and make it look like there are bubbles in the fluid when there aren't. Frustrating. If you go this route, spend a little more on a decent kit. Pressure bleeding pushes fluid in from the top at the reservoir under pressure. Faster still, very effective, popular with professional shops. The tool costs more, and you need to be careful not to overpressure the reservoir cap seal. But if you're going to bleed brakes regularly, it's worth the investment. Two-person bleeding is the traditional method your grandfather probably used. One person pumps the pedal, one person opens and closes the bleeder screw on command. It works well, it's fast, and it costs nothing. The downside is that it requires another human being who can follow simple instructions without getting creative. In my experience, that narrows the field considerably. For this walkthrough, we're going to cover gravity bleeding in full detail because it's the method that requires the least equipment, the least coordination, and produces excellent results. Then we'll cover the two-person method because it genuinely is faster and most people have at least one person they can press into service. What you actually need. This is the part where some videos hand you a shopping list that costs $80. That's not what's happening here. You need brake fluid in the correct specification for your car. This is not optional and it's not interchangeable. Your reservoir cap has the specification printed right on it. Dot 3, dot 4, dot 5.1. Use exactly that. Dot 5 is a completely different silicone-based fluid that doesn't mix with the others at all, and using it in a system designed for dot 4 is a memorable and expensive mistake. You need a clear plastic tube that fits snugly over your bleeder screws. The diameter varies by car, so check before you start, but a short length of aquarium tubing from any hardware store usually works and costs almost nothing. You need a clean jar or bottle to collect the old fluid. An old glass jar is fine. Brake fluid is corrosive to paint, so don't use anything you care about and keep it off your bodywork. You need a wrench to open the bleeder screws, usually an 8 or 10 millimeter. Check yours first, because a rounded off bleeder screw is one of the more unpleasant surprises this job can produce. You need fresh rags, nitrile gloves, because brake fluid is not pleasant on skin, and a turkey baster or a fluid transfer pump to pull old fluid out of the reservoir before you start. That last one confuses people, so we'll explain it in the next section. That's genuinely the whole list. No specialty tools required. Total cost for consumables, somewhere between $10 and $20 plus the fluid. Compare that to your last brake bleed invoice and take a moment to just sit with that. The one thing you must do before you start, before any fluid goes anywhere, open the hood and find your brake fluid reservoir. It's on top of the master cylinder, usually on the driver's side near the firewall, and it's translucent, so you can see the fluid level without opening it. Here's the thing most guides skip past. Before you start bleeding, use a turkey baster or a fluid transfer pump to remove most of the old fluid from the reservoir and replace it with fresh fluid. Not all of it. You don't want to run it dry and introduce air at the master cylinder, but most of it. The reason this matters is simple. Old, moisture-contaminated fluid is the whole problem you're solving. If you bleed the system but leave old degraded fluid sitting at the top in the reservoir, you're pushing fresh fluid through old fluid. You're only solving half the problem. Pull out as much of the old fluid as you can, top it up with fresh fluid, and now the whole system gets refreshed as you bleed. And then, this is critical, keep watching that reservoir throughout the entire job. Every time you open a bleeder screw and fluid flows out, the level in the reservoir drops. If it drops too far and the reservoir runs dry, air gets sucked into the master cylinder and works its way through the entire system. Now, instead of chasing one small air bubble in one corner of the car, you're bleeding the whole system from scratch. This is the mistake that turns a 30-minute job into an afternoon. Keep the reservoir above the minimum line at all times. Top it up between corners. Write that on your hand if you need to. The gravity bleed method. Jack the car up or get it on ramps. You need access to all four wheels. If you've never been under a car before, use proper jack stands, not just a floor jack, and not the little scissor jack from your trunk, which is designed for one specific emergency and not for you to lie underneath for 40 minutes. Safety first. And yes, I did have to learn that one the slightly embarrassing way. Locate the bleeder screws on each caliper. They're small, usually rubber-capped nipples, pointing outward from the caliper body. Pull the rubber cap off and keep it somewhere you won't lose it, because losing 4 tiny rubber caps is surprisingly easy. The order you bleed matters. Always start with the wheel furthest from the master cylinder and work your way closer. On most cars with the master cylinder on the driver's side, that means you start at the rear passenger wheel, then rear driver, then front passenger, then front driver. Some manufacturers specify a different sequence, so if your manual is in your glove box, now's a good time to check. If it isn't, that sequence works for the vast majority of cars. Fit your clear plastic tube snugly over the bleeder screw nipple and drop the other end into your jar with a small amount of fresh brake fluid already in it. The reason you put fluid in the jar is to submerge the end of the tube so you can clearly see bubbles rising through it. Now, using your wrench, open the bleeder screw about half a turn to 3/4 of a turn. Not all the way out. You just want it open enough for fluid to flow. And here's a detail worth knowing. Bleeder screws are often corroded and they can snap off if you force them. If yours are resisting, a little penetrating oil left to soak for 10 minutes before you start is good insurance. Once the screw is open, gravity does the work. Fluid will begin to drip or flow slowly through your tube and into the jar. Watch it. Early on, you'll likely see small air bubbles traveling through the clear tube. That's what you're flushing out. Let it flow until you see a steady stream of clean, clear, amber fluid with no bubbles at all. Then close the bleeder screw snugly, not over-tightened, just firm. Remove the tube, replace the rubber cap, go back to the reservoir, top it up with fresh fluid, and move to the next wheel in sequence. Do all 4. The whole job on a cooperative car with no stubbornly corroded bleeders takes about 45 minutes. About the same time the shop charges you for except you just spent $12 on fluid instead of $150 on labor. The math there is pretty straightforward. The two-person method for faster results. The two-person method moves faster and is particularly good if you're dealing with a lot of air in the system or you want very positive confirmation that everything is clear. The setup is the same. Tube on the bleeder screw, jar with fluid, same bleeding order. The difference is that instead of gravity pulling fluid through, your helper pumps the brake pedal to push it. Communicate clearly before you start because the coordination matters. Your helper presses the pedal slowly and holds it down. They call out down when it's at the floor. You open the bleeder screw, fluid and any air bubbles push through. When the flow slows, you close the bleeder screw first. Then, and only then, does your helper release the pedal. That sequence is important. If they release the pedal while the bleeder is still open, they suck air straight back into the caliper, and you've just undone your own work. Close the screw, then release the pedal. Say it out loud to each other before you start. So there's no confusion. Repeat the pump and hold cycle 2 or 3 times at each corner until the fluid runs completely clear and bubble-free. Then move on. The mistakes that ruin a brake bleed. Running the reservoir dry is the big one, and we've covered it. But it bears repeating because it's the mistake that causes the most frustration. Watch that reservoir level every single time you move to a new wheel, getting the bleeding order wrong. Some people start at the nearest wheel out of convenience. Don't. Furthest to closest. It matters because you're pushing fluid through the whole system progressively, and doing it out of a sequence can trap air in sections you haven't cleared yet. Cross-threading or over-tightening the bleeder screw. These screws are small, often corroded, and threaded into soft aluminum or cast iron. They want to be snug, and that's all. Put your full body weight into closing them, and you'll either snap the screw or strip the threads, and either one of those turns your brake bleed into a much larger and more expensive problem. Using the wrong fluid, worth saying again because the consequences are serious. Dot 3, 4, and 5.1 are glycol-based and compatible with each other within reason, though you should always try to match what's already in the system. Dot 5 is silicone-based and completely incompatible. If you're unsure what's in the car, flush the whole system with the correct fluid for your car and start fresh. And finally, stopping too soon. A lot of people close the bleeder the moment fluid starts flowing and assume the job is done. You need to keep going until the fluid running through your tube is completely clear, consistently bubble-free, and looks like fresh fluid, rather than the old, dark, contaminated stuff. Patience here is what separates a properly bled system from one you'll be redoing in 3 months. When to actually call a mechanic, I promised you honesty throughout this, and here it is one more time. If your bleeder screws are completely seized and snapping off rather than turning, stop. A snapped bleeder in a caliper can mean a caliper replacement, and that's a repair worth having done properly. If you bleed the system correctly and completely and the pedal is still soft or spongy, you likely have a failing master cylinder or a leak somewhere in the system. Bleeding doesn't fix leaks. It doesn't rebuild failing seals. If the symptom returns or doesn't improve, the brake system needs to be inspected by someone who can put it on a lift and trace the problem. Brakes are the one system on your car where the consequence of getting it wrong is not a repair bill. It's considerably worse than that if you have an ABS-equipped vehicle and you've had a significant air intrusion event, like a caliper line disconnected while the engine was running, or a major leak. The ABS module itself can trap air. Bleeding that out sometimes requires a scan tool to cycle the ABS pump. That's a shop job. Know where your competence ends and stay firmly on the right side of that line. Everything else on this list, you've got this. So there it is. The job that costs $150 at a shop, done in your driveway for the price of a bottle of brake fluid and an afternoon. No special equipment, no mystery. Just fluid, a tube, a jar, and the right sequence. Clean fluid in every corner, firm pedal, no air. Check your fluid spec on the reservoir cap. Keep the reservoir topped up. Bleed furthest to closest. Close the screw before you release the pedal. That's the whole job. If this saved you money, subscribe and drop your car's mileage in the comments. I want to see how long you've been keeping yours alive. And don't miss the next one, the brake job mistakes that mechanics see every single week, including the one that ruins brand new rotors before you've driven a single mile.